Okay. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started this evening. I'm going to introduce the speakers in order that they will be speaking. We have Dr. Carrie J. Malloy, an assistant professor of global humanities in the Department of Humanities at San Jose State University. He also serves as the director of community outreach for CGRE, that's us. His research focuses on indigenous genocide, healing, and reconciliation in North America, and the necessity of systemic change within social structures to advance transitional justice. He is a coordinator for and teaches in the Humanities Honors Program. His research explores the potential obstacles to initiating transitional justice in societies that have experienced genocide or mass atrocity events. And Dr. Christy Yoder has she's got her MA in Human Rights from Denver University and is currently enrolled in the PhD program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Gratz College. She has worked with Interaction, the Humanitarian Assistance Applied Research Group, and the Tool Slang Genocide Museum. And her goal is to bring genocide awareness to the average person, and founded the Center for Genocide Research and Education in 2016 and acts as its executive director, overseeing all functions for the center. Take it away.
Good evening, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. Today, we're going to look at rhetoric in connection to what is currently going on in the Ukraine. So we're going to look at components of the history that have led us to this. We're going to talk about what is genocide, the claims that are being made around genocide, including those that were made yesterday by the President of the United States, and on what steps that you can take to further work in prevention, to further the work of looking at genocide in a way that causes us to act rather than to sit back and be passive about it. We're going to start first with the history of Ukraine and Russian relations, and this is a very long history, and we're going to condense this down into easily to understand bite, and we're only going to start in 1905. We have to understand the pogroms that occurred throughout Ukraine extended further back into the 1800s. These were violent uprisings that targeted Jews in Ukraine simply because of who they were. The 1905 program, or the October program, occurred between October 18th and 22nd in 1905, when Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire. 400 Jews were killed and over 16,000 properties were destroyed. And this was rooted in anti-Semitism. It was rooted in the belief that simply because these individuals were Jewish, that they were a threat. There was a large support amongst the Jewish community for Japan and its war against Russia at this time. That was another cause of this. They were seen as a threat to internal security within the Russian Empire and the large economic downturn that was occurring. Adding to this, Tsar Nicholas II issued the October Manifesto, which extended rights, voting rights, privileges that enfranchised Jewish people throughout the empire, and particularly in the area of Ukraine. The more conservative side of society saw this as empowering what they believed would be a more liberal Jewish state. This led to extreme violence throughout the region. When we look at societies that are at risk for genocide, we look for a series of risk factors. And one of those risk factors is a history of violent conflict. Knowing that these type of programs extended back into the 1800s and into the present, we have the basis for something that we would begin to look at, saying, there is a risk here. Something is potentially is going to happen here. We need to be fully aware of that. And that leads us to what happened in the 1930s. the Holodomor, death by hunger. Ukraine at this point is part of the Soviet Union. It is one of the largest producers of grain throughout the country. And there's an experience here of a loss of millions of tons of grain between 1931, where they produced 7.4 million tons of grain, to 1932, where the production was 4.3 million. This is a massive loss of a food source, one that we are actually hearing talked about in the current conflict, of the ability of Ukraine to produce grain, to produce large amounts of agriculture that supply not just Ukraine, but the world. Economists are telling us, forecasters are telling us that if the war continues, we're going to see grain prices begin to rise and see an economic impact around the world because of this. In 1932-33, the Soviet Union under Stalin had imposed collectivization, forcing farmers into collective farming, reducing their ability to make individual choices on what they grew, when they grew it, how they grew it. This caused a massive drop in production, and it affected the rural economies. It disorganized them. It broke them apart. They were no longer functioning as they always had. And this led to a series of food shortages. Under Stalin, rationing was put into effect around grain, and large parts of the grain that was produced, that was grown throughout the Ukraine, was shipped to Russia itself. This meant that the individuals who were growing grain, who were producing the food source, were now put in a position where they didn't have the very thing that they were growing. 3.9 million Ukrainians are believed to have died in the Holodomor. This was a state act with intent. The intent was to remove the food source, something that people need to survive. So we have this continuation of a violent history and a dehumanization of individuals not seen that they're fit to even be fed. So we have that continuation here and that connection to a longer history. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Yoder, who will carry us through.
So now we are going to jump ahead quite a bit to 2013, 2014. The president at the time was a person named Yanukovych. He was democratically elected in 2010, which is interesting in itself because in 2004, he had actually tried to steal the election, but he was democratically elected in 2010. At the time, there was a push to become more economically interdependent with the European Union, and that's what the association agreement was about. It was sort of a trade agreement, and Ukraine had a choice between allying itself with the European Union or allying itself with Russia. Although they might have done both, Russia was not open to having any sort of relationship at that point with somebody that was working with the European Union. Yanukovych was very tight with Russia, and on November 21st, 2013, he announced that he was not going to sign the association agreement with the European Union. The signing of the association agreement was very popular with the people in Ukraine. And when this announcement came out, protesters began to gather in Independence Square in Kyiv. The Ukrainian word for square is Maidan, which is where the name for this protest comes from. It's Euromaidan. Early on the morning of November 30th, security forces, specifically they were the riot police called the Berkut, attacked the protesters. And in response to that, the protesters began to form self-defense units. Now they were not only protesting against the fact that the association agreement was not getting signed, they were also raging against police brutality and authoritarianism. The reason they were protesting authoritarianism is that when Yanukovych was elected, he immediately started to backslide into autocracy. During the holidays, during December and January, the number of protests did decline, but they were going to pick back up again. Yanukovych passed something called the dictatorship laws, and this outlawed certain protest tactics. It curtailed foreign NGO activities, and it caused renewed protests and calls for Yanukovych to resign. Although Yanukovych did repeal some of these laws, the protesters wanted all of them repealed. And in addition, they wanted to return to the 2004 Constitution, which Yanukovych had moved away from. And of course, they wanted the association agreement to be signed. Russia actually encouraged Yanukovych to respond very forcefully to the protests. Despite the brutality that was going on against the protesters, there was some progress made towards a compromise between the sides. However, this all came to an end on February 18th in 2014. Protesters marched on the parliament and demanded a return to the 2004 Constitution. Security forces responded by using live ammo, rubber bullets, tear gas, and flash grenades. 2 days later, protesters attacked a police line and the police opened fire on the protesters, killing at least 70 protesters. Around this time, France, Germany, Poland, and Russia got together with some of the opposition leaders. There were actually several opposition groups at this point. Some were more nationalist than others, and a deal was brokered. Interestingly, everybody that brokered this deal signed it except for Russia. But at this point, it was too late, and protesters were adamant that Yanukovych resign. On February 21st, a deal was the agreement was announced in the Maidan, and one of the self-defense leaders got up on stage and stated that Yanukovych had until 10 o'clock the following morning to resign, or protesters were going to start taking government buildings by force. In response, Parliament passed a bill returning to the 2004 Constitution and giving protesters amnesty. But the writing was on the wall at this point. Party members that supported Yanukovych began to leave the party and actually left Kyiv. Seeing that the party members that used to support Yanukovych were leaving, the security forces abandoned their posts as well, and Yanukovych fled the country. This leads right into the annexation of Crimea, which is the beginning of the current conflict. On February 20th, while the protests were still going on, a speaker of the Crimean parliament suggested that Crimea could secede. Russian troops were actually put on alert on February 18th, so they were already anticipating some kind of operation. And peacekeeping operations then began 2 days after that. On February 27th, 60 heavily armed men seized the Crimean Parliament and Council of Ministers buildings and raised Russian flags over them. Some of the parliament members that were pro-Russian voted to replace the prime minister with a pro-Russian, Sergei Aksyonov. Aksyonov was accused of being involved in organized crime. The following day, soldiers in unmarked uniforms, who came to be known as Little Green Men, seized the Simferopol and Sevastopol airports. At the same time, a Russian Navy ship blockaded the harbor at Balaclava, where the Ukrainian Coast Guard is located. Then on March 1st, Aksyonov requested Russian intervention, and Putin formally requested permission from the Federation Council to use Russian troops in Crimea. Aksionov and Putin both specified the territory of Ukraine and not just Crimea. During this time, even though Russian troops were present in Crimea, Putin denied that the troops were there. And on March 6th, the Crimean parliament voted to join the Russian Federation, and they moved the referendum on joining the Russian Federation up to March 16th. At the same time, Russia began exercises near Kharkiv. On March 17th, the day after the referendum, the Crimean parliament formally requested that they be annexed to Russia. And on the 18th, the agreement for annexation was signed. On March 21st, Putin signed the annexation of Crimea into Russian law. One of the reasons that the annexation of Crimea occurred, there's actually a couple of reasons. Russia has historically felt that Ukraine was part of Russia from the very beginning, and that it's at the core of Russian culture and politics. And so Putin is desiring to return back to a time when Ukraine was a part of Russia, and they consider it to be essential. One of the other reasons some of this may have occurred is that after the Cold War ended, expectations for what the world order would look like were different between the superpowers, whereas the United States felt that Russia might move more towards democracy. Russia was actually longing to return back to a time when it was a superpower and wanted to have a say in the politics of the European Union. And I am going to turn it over to Carrie to talk about what genocide is.
What we've set up for you leading into the legal definitions, we've talked about some of the risk factors related to genocide, the history of violence, stability of government, whether that is internal stability or impacts from external forces, rhetoric around history, and the targeting of groups. All of these are factors that we look at to determine if a society is on the verge of genocide, not just from internal factors, but those that are external. And as you can see, many of those factors exist in Ukraine, in particular in its relationship to Russia. And that brings us to understanding what genocide means legally. And I'm going to make a very clear distinction here. There is the legal definition of genocide, and then there is the common or multi-used word of genocide. We're going to deal only with the legal component. We'll talk about the rest here in a second. Genocide was defined in 1948 by the United Nations, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. It is important to understand that the Convention on Genocide was one of the very first acts of the United Nations and was done the day before the passage of the Human Rights Convention. So out of World War II came two of the main components of what we now understand to be international human rights law. What Article 2 of the Convention tells us is what genocide is legally, what the definition is legally. And it says in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. The key component of the definition, before we get into what constitutes, is the word intent. This is the hardest part of genocide to prove. In the legal realm, you have to prove beyond reasonable doubt. When we look at what the trials that have taken place at The Hague, one of the sticking points of why genocide is very difficult to prove is that intent component and the need to show that it was the intent of the perpetrator to destroy in whole or in part. In whole or in part does not have a number connected to it. So what that means is you don't actually have to, as we tend to talk about genocide as just the killing of individuals. It doesn't have to be that. There is no number associated with it. And that's an important thing to understand is we're not basing this on the number of people killed. We're basing this on the intent of individuals. And what constitutes genocide? It is the killing of members of the group, and that group must be national, ethnical, racial, or religious, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of a group. So you have a physical component here, the physical harming of the body, but also we have mental harm, the harm that is inflicted on the psyche from the actions that are taken. Missile bombardment, torture, all of those come into this component. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. This does include military action, but it also includes an intentional famine. It includes withholding the resources necessary for life. So all of that comes into play here. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. That could be forced sterilizations. That could be anything that prevents the birth from happening. The convention has not been amended since it was passed in 1948. However, it has been expanded. And in the tribunals out of Rwanda, the courts have held that rape is an act of genocide, is connected to genocide, and is included in this. So it is a component that isn't here, and I'm putting it here with the imposing the measures intended to prevent births, because rape is generally seen as a way just to abuse women, but it's also a way to prevent births. It's a way to stop the procreation of another generation of a people. And the last component is the forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, taking children without the consent of their legal guardians away from them, removing them from the cultures, from the families in which they were born into. And this is generally done as a mechanism of assimilation to turn them into something else. And we've seen this throughout history and how we've gone on. So these are the main components of the legal definition. So the bigger question is, well, if we know what genocide is legally, what would bring someone before the courts? The first is genocide as defined in Article 2 that we just walked through. The second is conspiracy to commit genocide, that an individual was part of the planning, somehow helped the planning, and understood the intent of what they were doing. That word intent is going to keep coming back up over and over and over again as we go through this. It is important to understand that that is the crux of the definition. The other component here is direct and public incitement to commit genocide. And this is one of the things we did actually see quite a bit in Rwanda, the directing of mobs to attack churches, to attack places in which Tutsis were hiding. And we can see that happening, and we pay attention to all of that. An attempt to commit genocide and complicity in genocide. And I think the complicity is the hardest one here to wrap our heads around, because what does it mean to be complicit? That includes not doing anything. That includes providing the grounds or the facilities in which genocide could be committed. The legal definition is not without controversy. It was coined in 1943 by a Jewish Polish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin, who fled ahead of the Nazi takeover of Europe. He combined two words, genos, race or tribe from the Greek, and cide, to kill from the Latin, into genocide. And he gave us a word to describe a crime that has been with humanity since we started walking the earth. He gave us a way to express the crime of crimes. Yet the definition legally has come under a great deal of scrutiny because we are trying to still figure out how we apply it to specific cases. We don't tend to label a genocide while it is happening. We tend to look backwards and say, oh, that was a genocide. Rwanda was definitely a genocide that we called while it was happening. And there is some, we're going to get into the reasons why we hold off on using it. There are arguments that this definition is too narrow. Within the scholarly community, there are over 37 academic definitions for genocide that individual scholars use in their work to write about genocide, to look at prevention. And that still doesn't seem to be enough because we keep adding to them. A few years ago, Adam Jones published his comprehensive introduction to genocide, and he had around 28 definitions. And in his third edition, now we're up to almost 40. We are still wrapping our heads around what this word means and how do we use it. But we're also questioning its power, because there's an argument that the definition in itself has become devalued by overuse, that we are calling too many things genocide. And there is a discussion within a large segment of scholars over how we use this word. But we know that the definition under the UN is the legal definition that we use. The objections that are generally raised are the convention doesn't include social or political groups. The USSR at the time of the passing of the convention wasn't really interested in having political groups included in this. Social groups were also left out at the request of other nations. The arguments are that the definition is limited to only acts against people and doesn't include what we do to the environment as a way to hurt people, or how we affect and disrupt cultural distinctiveness. One of the biggest objections is, how do we prove intent? What is it that we use to legally prove that an individual, a group of individuals, a country, intent was to destroy in whole or in part? The other controversy is members of the United Nations, sovereign states, and we will talk about this one shortly, are hesitant to call out another member nation as a genocidaire, someone who commits genocide. There's a hesitancy there within the diplomatic realm to label a country as a perpetrator of genocide. The other complication with the definition of genocide is the body of international law around the convention and of itself is still being built. It is only really out of the cases from Rwanda and Yugoslavia that we are beginning to build a larger understanding of and way in which to apply the convention in a legal fashion. So even though we have an international document that tells us what genocide is, tells us that it should be prevented, tells us how we should punish it, the mechanisms to carry that out have not been fully developed. And many of the countries that have been accused of genocide are not part of the international bodies, international justice bodies, that would actually carry out the trials and carry out issuing sentences. So therefore, there's a lack of jurisdiction. And one of the more frustrating components is we have not yet defined how we measure in part. What does that in whole or in part really tell us to do? And is it a number of deaths? Is it a number of amputations? What does that mean? We are still wrestling with those components. So when we see individuals and world leaders step back and refrain from using the word, a lot of it isn't that they're afraid to use it, it's there are these controversies around it and how did they prove it? And it is in the politics of genocide that it gets even more complicated. And Raphael Lemkin, who coined the word, has an interesting story about how he began his research and his life's work to defining and trying to prevent this atrocity. And he had gone to one of his law professors and asked him, particularly about the Armenian genocide, why wouldn't the international community not intervene in this atrocity? And his law professor gave him a very unsatisfactory answer. His answer was this: if you are walking down the road and you see a farmer taking his chickens and butchering his chickens, would you try to stop him? And the answer is no, they're his chickens. What the professor was saying is that states, nation states, have a recognized sovereignty to do with their people as they choose. That there is this international norm of not interfering with the internal matters of another nation. At this point in time, in the 1930s, 1940s, it's not really until we come into the current century that we begin to really mess with the internal politics of other countries. The politics of genocide are based around national sovereignty and what that means to interfere with another country's sovereignty. If we accuse another nation of genocide, if we act to prevent a nation from carrying out genocide within the realm of their exercise of sovereignty, what does that mean for us as a country? Does that mean someone else can interfere with the United States or someone can interfere with another nation? These are legal questions and moral questions that we are still wrestling with. While our reaction generally would be, yes, we need to do something. Those who sit in positions of power are trying to understand this from the perspective of international norms. And what does it mean if we interfere? And what are the eventual ramifications of that interference? It is rare that you will hear world leaders accuse another world leader or another country of genocide. When Secretary of State John Kerry used those words to describe what was happening to the Yazidi, it was groundbreaking because that doesn't happen very often. We don't normally hear that because we are very protective of this concept of sovereignty and what it means. And even in the United Nations, they recognize within the convention itself the sovereignty of the state, the sovereignty of a nation. And that is a political component that we are still wrestling with and have no real good answer how we get around. And I wish I could sit here and say, we've got an answer. We don't have the answer. And this is an argument that is ongoing, and we will see, I suspect, an incredible amount of work done because of what is currently going on in the world.
So now I want to turn to the claims of genocide that have been made by both sides. Early on in the Ukraine conflict that's going on now, Russia made claims of genocide against Ukraine. This is not new for them. They did this in 2014 as well as part of their disinformation campaign. So in 2014, they accused the government in Kyiv of being full of fascists, which echoes what they're saying now about denazification. Russia accused Ukraine of targeting Russian speakers, and that's what they mean when they are talking about genocide. They're saying this group that speaks Russian that happen to live in Ukraine are being targeted and being killed by Ukrainian nationalists. In 2014, the UN investigated these claims and released a report of its findings. In its report, it says, although there were some attacks against the ethnic Russian community, these were neither systematic nor widespread. And they pointed out misinformed reports and greatly exaggerated stories of harassment against ethnic Russians by Ukrainian nationalist extremists. So I think we can conclude that Russia's claims of genocide against the Ukrainians are false, and it is simply part of their disinformation campaign that they are using to garner support. The Ukrainian claims of genocide, however, do tend to hold more water. And I'm going to go through just some of the things that lead us to think that this actually could be a genocide. For one thing, during genocide, there are certain patterns that we have noticed over time that tend to emerge. The killing of all fighting age males and mass rape. Both of these have occurred in Ukraine. The video coming out of Bucha just last week showed that fighting age males had been executed, and there are stories and there's evidence that women and children are being raped in Ukraine as well. There is a national, if we look at the definition, the legal definition, there is a national group that's being targeted. In this case, a Ukrainian group. Members of the group are obviously being killed. But in addition to that, serious bodily and mental harm is being caused to the survivors. They're being bombarded on a constant basis. They're having their escape routes blocked. They are unable to get humanitarian aid because it gets blocked coming in. And that leads us into conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of the group. That's definitely being imposed. And perhaps the best example of this is Mariupol, where people are starving and the Russian troops are not allowing humanitarian aid to reach these people. There are also allegations that Ukrainians have been deported to Russia, basically being given the choice of staying in Ukraine and dying or going to Russia. And that once they get to Russia, their children are being taken away from the parents and being put up for adoption. And this goes to the component of transferring members of one group to another group. They're trying to assimilate these Ukrainian children into the Russian culture. Intent, as Carrie mentioned, is something that is very difficult to prove, and very often we don't have a smoking gun even after the fact. It's very rare to see somebody put something down on paper. However, an article by a Russian propagandist just came out within the last week or so. And in this article, this Russian propagandist is talking about what should be done with Ukraine. And he lays it out very clearly that anybody he considers to be a Nazi, which is basically anybody that does not support Russia, should be killed. And that doesn't stop with the troops that are fighting. He goes on to say that there are people in the general population that are also Nazis that don't support Russia and are, pushing their agenda, as he would put it, that should also be eliminated. And so I think with all of these things, I think we have a pretty clear idea that we probably can call this a genocide. And yesterday, President Biden called Ukraine a genocide. That was kind of astonishing because, as Carrie said, many times nations are very reluctant to call out genocide when they see it. And one other reason that they don't like to do that is there's some question as to whether or not they're obligated under the Genocide Convention to intervene if they call it a genocide. So what effect does this have practically that Biden called Ukraine a genocide? In terms of intervention, I really don't think that it means anything. US and NATO are not going to risk the conflict spilling over and involving other NATO countries or potentially sparking World War III. And Russia is a nuclear power, so they are riskier to confront. In addition, Russia sits on the UN Security Council. They're a permanent member with veto power. And so there won't be most likely any UN peacekeeping operations that would be sent to Ukraine. A Chapter 6 mandate under the UN is a peacekeeping operation where the peacekeepers are essentially observers. They're not allowed to engage either side. Whereas Chapter 7 has more teeth and it allows the peacekeepers to use force if necessary to enforce the peace. In terms of justice, what does it mean that we've called this a genocide? Well, neither the US nor Russia are parties to the Rome Statute, which is the body of law that created the International Criminal Court, and therefore they aren't bound by it. In addition, we've seen from other leaders that have been indicted in The Hague for genocide that Putin basically just has to avoid traveling to non-friendly countries so he can avoid being picked up by anybody that would deliver him to The Hague. And already the US is questioning how much assistance to give the International Criminal Court in documenting war crimes because they are not a party to the Rome Statute. So it is important that Biden called this a genocide, and hopefully will make people more aware of what is going on. But in practicality, it doesn't seem like it adds up to much in terms of action. So what can you do? I mean, this all seems pretty grim, and it is. But one of the biggest things you can do is to call your representatives and let them know that you care about what's happening in Ukraine. When the Rwanda genocide was occurring, Alison DeForge, who is an expert on Rwanda, asked Anthony Lake, who was in the US government, why the US wasn't getting involved. And his response to her was, because my phone isn't ringing. Politicians are going to calculate the political cost of getting involved. And if they are not hearing from their constituents about it, they are going to assume that it's going to be politically costly for them to get involved. Whereas if they feel like people actually care about what's occurring, they are likely to calculate that maybe it's not as costly for them to get involved, but that it might be more costly for them to do nothing. Another thing that you can do is to learn to consume media critically so you can spot misinformation. And we are hoping to give a webinar upcoming soon about how to critically consume media and hopefully how to spot fake stories. There are, some things that are very difficult about spotting misinformation out there because there are some fakes that are very good, but it's important to educate yourself. And when you do see information, be respectful, but call it out when you hear it or you see it. And finally, post on social media about the conflict to keep it in the public eye. You can tell from the news coverage now, we're a little over a month into this war and news coverage is already starting to decrease. And I think that we need to keep this in the public eye so that it's not forgotten as just something that happens over there. So that's all we have for tonight. If you have any questions, you can put it in the chat. I don't know, this is my first time using Zoom for a webinar, so I don't know if you can unmute yourself. But for sure, if you have a question, put it in the chat or the Q&A, and we will do our best to answer it.
We do have one question. The question is, wouldn't rape be mental and physical harm rather than the prevention of births? It actually falls into both categories. One of the things that is very frustrating about the convention is that it can be put into many of the different categories that we're talking about. So different acts can fall in multiple categories.
And just to add on to that, for example, in Bosnia, where there were mass rapes and these women were held until they could not have an abortion, the reason that was considered preventing births within a group was because the nationality of the child in Bosnia was determined by the nationality of the father. And so they considered the child, the product of rape, to be a Serbian child. And the other thing is that we do have reports that are starting to come out now from Ukraine of Russian soldiers telling women that they are going to rape them until they can no longer have children. And so it's creating physical damage.
Does anybody else have any questions? Raise your hand, we can unmute you, or we can just call it a night. All right, everybody, I guess we're calling it a night. Thank you much for attending. And
if you missed any part of the webinar, we are going to have it available on our website. It's genocideresearch.org. So you will be able to find it there in about a week.
okay, perfect. Thanks so much, everybody.
Yes, thank you for coming.
Thank you.